campaign for more money to tackle the effects of climate change.
We simply must seize the current window of opportunity to reimagine our global systems in a way that puts nature, people and planet at the heart of how we operate.
Prince William has taken aim at billionaires investing in space tourism after the launch of Jeff Bezos' spacecraft, New Shepard.
We need some of the world's greatest brains and minds fixed on trying to repair this planet, not trying to find the next place to go and live.
The royal calls come ahead of the COP26 UN conference in Glasgow next month. Well, New South Wales will be the first state to scrap hotel and home quarantine for returning Australian citizens, residents and their families. Margie Osmond is the CEO of Tourism and Transport Forum Australia. She's told Patricia Karvelis the New South Wales Premier was always likely to prioritise Australian residents in opening international travel.
I think what Premier Perrottet has done is made it abundantly clear to the business community and to the tourism sector that he's not standing in our way. So that when it is the right moment, we'll be getting into it immediately. I think that critically we've got to get those Australians home. The fact that there's not going to be quarantine now is a great outcome in terms of what it will mean to TGA-approved, fully vaccinated travellers in the next round of this. But we desperately need students and we need backpackers back because that's part of the skills and employee problem we've got, and we need to fix that.
OK. Under the national plan, people were meant to quarantine but at home in the next phase. It looks like we're skipping that phase in New South Wales. Is that your understanding?
Well, it would seem so. The devil is always in the detail with these things. My understanding is that what now has to be sorted is what testing would look like and how that process will work to make the quarantine less of an issue. Essentially, though, what we've been saying long and loud to whoever would listen is that nobody's coming here if they've got a quarantine from either a leisure tourism, a business or an education perspective. Just not going to happen. So as a consequence now, the fact that there's discussion about anyone getting here without quarantine is progress. And we heartily applaud the New South Wales government for stepping out there and saying, yes, this is perfectly possible. OK,
I get from your perspective why this is a positive thing, but equally it doesn't seem nationally coordinated. The New South Wales announcement was quite unexpected. Is there enough time to try and organise this? And do you worry that there hasn't been that coordination with the other states and territories?
Look, I think if COVID's been characterised by anything, it may be a lack of organisation between state and territories. I'm not certain how this makes, is any different to what we've all had to live with for quite some time. I think that 2 weeks, given the amount of conversation that has been going on for some time between the industry and the state government, the industry and the federal government, that probably, the 2 weeks that we're going to have will be enough to get things up and running in that first instance for Australians coming home. And we're going to need a little bit longer to sort out a few other issues like internationally accepted quarantine certificates for other visitors. But, the important thing here too is that with international traffic, we've got to have international capacity. So we are going to need some time to get the aviation routes back in place and get those planes back in the air so we've got seats to put bottoms on.
Are you hopeful that the other states and territories will follow New South Wales's lead? And I suppose I'm looking very deliberately here to Victoria, which is already a COVID state. In fact, the highest COVID and daily numbers we're seeing in the country.
Well, yes, but I think that really in the case of New South Wales and Victoria, even though they may have managed it somewhat differently, the issue is still a concern level for not only their community, which must be their number one concern, but also for the economy. And I am sure that the Victorians are just as focused on making sure the jobs in their economy starts turning over with a lot more vigour and vim than we've seen up to this point. So I'd be reasonably confident that the Victorians will head in the same direction as New South Wales. The big question then is around some of the other states like Queensland, Western Australia, etc. Because once again, if you are an international visitor, lovely as Sydney is and wonderful as New South Wales and Victoria are, you do want to go to the Great Barrier Reef or Uluru or Mingaloo or the Barossa Valley. So we need those other borders to be open.
Yeah, look, Australians want to go there too.
Yes, of
Just
course.
to be clear. I mean, you know, I can't go there, let alone international visitors. So in terms of these quarantine facilities some of the states and territories are building, you know, I'm thinking Victoria in partnership with the federal government, do you think they should still go ahead? Is it wise to still plan to do that, even though it looks like we're phasing out quarantining?
Look, I do think that there is a bit of a question mark around these custom-built facilities. I mean, nobody's silly enough to say this is the last we're going to see of the pandemic. I think if it's done anything, it's been full of surprises. But, you know, the other critical part of this is I think everybody needs to do a big cheer and a pat on the back for the hotel industry, because they essentially provided the quarantine capacity throughout the pandemic and made it possible for us to operate with a quarantine capacity. So I think the hotels have done a magnificent job. I think given that quarantine is looking like more of a short-term priority, it's quite likely that those hotels are still going to be called upon, because, you know, this process is going to be turned off, hopefully, you know, in the early part of next year.
So you reckon this opens the door basically to get those international routes really organised and, you know, back functioning, because they've been dormant for so long and it's been such a big issue. What's the time frame then that you're working towards for tourists to be able to come, not just people returning to their own country or being able to leave their own country, which is of course huge, but people being able to come to Sydney and then fly to Uluru? What sort of time frame do you think that's feasible in?
Well, I have to be honest, it will depend upon the borders. And it will depend upon international quarantine. Now, we've made big steps in that direction by the federal government, having made the announcement about accepting Sinovac and COVID Shield. So that's our biggest previous market and our biggest potential market, China and India. So we've got that bit of the part of the puzzle sorted. But essentially, if we want people to come here for leisure, holidays, and Australia is one of those bucket list destinations. People come here for the holiday of a lifetime. So they want to see lots of things. We need the state borders open if we're going to get international tourism back up and running in a big way. But having said that, if just New South Wales opened, we could see 50% of our previous international activity happen pretty quickly in New South Wales.
Analysis by the nation's peak medical bodies suggests our public hospitals won't cope as the country begins to ease restrictions. The Australian Medical Association has found ICU demand will soar, with emergency departments overcrowded and longer waits for elective surgery. Political reporter Steph Dalzell has more from Canberra.
So this analysis gives us some insight into how much public hospitals are currently struggling and the potential toll of opening up and seeing those additional COVID cases in hospitals. Now, it found that the majority of public hospitals were at 100% capacity already or close to that, and it said that many would simply be tipped over the edge by the influx of COVID-19 patients that we would see as the nation begins easing restrictions, which of course it already has done. Now, the AMA looked at 3 different scenarios. The first, which it called its best case scenario or its most optimistic, used the same modelling that the Doherty Institute has performed for National Cabinet. So that's the pathway out of the pandemic. The medium case scenario used similar modelling. However, it also used the viral assumptions that we've seen in the UK, so the way the virus has behaved there. The worst case scenario did all of those things. However, it didn't adjust for Australia's vaccine rate like the medium scenario, and it's worth knowing that Australia has significantly higher vaccine rates than the UK did when they opened up. But under all of the scenarios, they found that ICU demand would increase quite significantly within 12 months of opening up. So we would see as little as 7% increase under that best case scenario and up to 47.5% increase on ICU demand under the worst case scenario. They also found that emergency departments would be further overloaded, elective surgery waiting lists would blow out even more, and overall between 400 and 2,400 beds out of about 63,000 in the system would be permanently occupied by COVID-19 patients on an average day. Take a listen to the AMA President Omar Khorshid talking through the impact of opening up.
We have a real crisis in our hospitals due to a surge in demand, and the underlying cause of not being able to cope with that surge in demand is a long-term lack of investment in the infrastructure and the capacity of the system.
So this has landed in a really bitter debate that we've seen play out between the nation's leaders about who should pick up the ultimate health cost of opening up. So at the moment, public hospital funding is split by about 45-55. The federal government picks up 45%, states pick up the rest. That's increased to 50-50 during the pandemic. The federal government, they're acknowledging the impact on public hospitals as we open up. The states and territories are really concerned about the impact on their hospitals as we ease restrictions. So they've asked the federal government to permanently increase their share of funding to 50-50. And the AMA says that's a really great solution because that would also enable the states then to use the extra 5% that they're saving and reinvest them back in public hospitals, meaning public hospitals are getting more money. But the federal government's dismissed that. It says that it has already increased spending during the pandemic by more than $6 billion. And it also argues that it has increased its spending by far more than the states have over the past few years.
The world's largest space agency is getting ready to launch rockets from the remote Northern Territory in a matter of months. NASA scientists have been fine-tuning settings at the East Arnhem Space Base and they're confident takeoff is well within sight.
Deep in northeast Arnhem Land, from sacred red earth to the skies above.
In so many respects, this is another signal that Australia as a nation is open for launch business.
The countdown is on at NASA's first commercial launch pad outside of the United States. A small step for the world's largest space agency, a big leap for the local region after the recent windback of its major employer, a bauxite mine.
I see space as a huge part of the future of Nullarbor, and that obviously will bring some tourists with it as well, so I think people do want to see rockets go to space.
Years in the making, the project was delayed by coronavirus, but is firing ahead with almost 30 international NASA personnel now at work in the region.
It's been a learning curve, I think. We'd anticipated working 10-hour days, thinking it would be nice and easy, and around 8 hours, that's about enough before we need to get in the air condition.
The base's location near the equator makes it an optimum launch site.
What that gives you is extra rotational velocity. It means it throws your rocket off more quickly, you need less fuel.
And unlike several major projects across the top end, this one is being guided by and employing Indigenous hands.
What we see here is just the beginning to a new beginning.
It's here at this launch rail that the first rockets will go up into space in June next year. However, they'll look a little bit different to the rockets that science fiction lovers are used to. Instead, at 15 metres long, they'll go up more than 200 kilometres, where they'll be in zero gravity conditions.
Studying the atmosphere of other planets. So there are 3 separate experiments run by 2 different universities out of the United States.
Once the initial liftoff is achieved, the centre could send up to 100 rockets into space each year, with hope benefits continue flowing to those on the ground below. Jesse Thompson, ABC News, Nhulunbuy.
Time for a look at the day's sports news now. Here's Jared Coode.